happy hour. Last week, we started off with the Shylights, Marshall Thompson of the Shylights. And so you can check it out over at YouTube. Like our channel, and we would really appreciate it. And I'm happy to turn off the TV for this hour or two that we have today to take a break. But anyway, I am so happy and honored today to introduce a dear friend. He was the 10th president of Morehouse College and now president emeritus. Plus, he was a Morehouse man. Currently, he's Langley Professor of Morals at Emory College in Atlanta, Georgia. He's an educator, world traveled. He was a visiting scholar at Stanford University, Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. He's an author of several books. He's active in a range of organizations. He's a minister ordained in 2 Christian denominations, American Baptist Church and Church of God in Christ. He's accomplished so much. I mean, his resume reads like who's who. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today about moral leadership, which we need now. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Send them in, and while we have this opportunity to have dialogue. So if you would please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Robert M. Franklin. Hey, Dr. Franklin, how are you?
I'm very good. Very good. Thank you. Good evening. It's a little later here on the East Coast. So.
Oh, that is correct. That is correct. But it is happy hour. So cheers.
Somewhere. Thank you.
Okay. That's why we call it Roz's happy hour. So there's so much to talk about. But let me just, before we start, give a shout out to Dr. Franklin, Dr. Cheryl Franklin. Hello, if she's watching. Thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure to meet both of you guys and to maintain the friendship that we have. So the reason for our conversation today is to discuss your new book, Moral Leadership. Wow, that's timing. The timing is perfect. So thank you also for mentioning my husband and myself in the book. You also mentioned my cousin, Bob Davison, and you mentioned my pastor, Dr. Claiborne Lee Jr. That is amazing. Thank you so much. And so let's talk about how we met. Do you remember how we met before we go into the book?
Well, my recollection is, in fact, I opened the book by describing the commencement ceremony when I was introduced to the commencement audience as my distinguished predecessor, Dr. Walter Massey, was departing. And so following the commencement, and during the presidential reception or commencement reception at the Davidson House, named in honor of the board chair and your cousin and family, I think we had a chance to visit then and learn more about your family's connections to Morehouse and all the terrific work you've been doing for the school. So I think that was the first time we crossed paths.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, I was already working at Morehouse, bringing in the entertainment for Candle in the Dark, which was my favorite, and it's still my favorite event to this day.
Yes.
You know, so while you were there, how was it working with these young African American men and preparing them to be successful in knowing that they would, in they would be faced with discrimination.
Yes, yes. Well, I reflect on that very question, Roz, in the second chapter of the book. So while it's a book about moral leadership, I also think about and talk about the role of institutions that produce leaders. And that can be all kinds of institutions, schools, colleges like Morehouse and others, but also houses of worship, fraternities, sororities, all kinds of organizations can encourage moral leadership as I define it. Women and men who are possess integrity, courage, and imagination, and who serve the common good while inviting others to join them. And so the second chapter I open with a famous photograph of young Martin Luther King Jr., still a teenager while at Morehouse. He's seated on the front row of the chapel.
Wow.
And I open with the words, imagine what it's like to preside at a ceremony where there are 2,000 talented, energetic young African American men seated there. And you know that these young leaders can change the world, can turn it upside down. And then I go on from there to talk about how the college culture contributed to that. And in particular, I tried to elaborate my vision, the so-called five wells,
Yes,
which
yes.
most students are familiar with by now, that I wanted all the students to be well-read, well-spoken, well-traveled, well-dressed, and well-balanced.
Talk about well-traveled. I understand you are well-traveled. I think you went to see some penguins or penguins or
Yeah.
Antarctica or something like that. Oh my God. That must have been an amazing journey. Is that where
Mhm.
you wrote the book?
No, I thought about the book then during that time away, but I'm hoping if I have another book in me, I'd like to reflect on my travels, and certainly, most of my travels have been done with my wife Cheryl, as you mentioned, and I'd like to reflect on some of our learnings in different cultures and contexts, and indeed, at least for me, all seven continents.
Mm,
That our Antarctica was the last, so that was the
mhm,
special one,
mhm.
and that's where I got up close and personal with penguins.
Penguins, wow. So Dr. Franklin, I did want to thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to book talent,
Hmm. Hmm.
producing the Timeless Voice concert with Eddie Levert, Dennis
Hmm.
Edwards, and Johnny Gill.
Hmm.
Being a part of the Martin Luther King Monument dedication in Washington, D.C. was unbelievable, unforgettable. Um, and in your book, you tie in the entertainment industry. So I was really interested in that. You talked
Hmm.
about the OJs. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I commend you again because you brought terrific people to Morehouse. For a while, we were the envy of HBCUs in America because our homecoming shows were just fabulous. And so much of that was due to your connections, your network, and Trichet Enterprises
Thank
that
you.
brought folks in for us. So we still celebrate that. But it was my pleasure to spend some time with the OJs, thanks to you. And
Thank you.
at a certain point in the book, I talk about how artists and people who use their imagination can help prepare the way for the next world that needs to be born, to the next society, which is something we should all be thinking about now as we move through this difficult period in American life. And I had to cite their wonderful song, Love Train. People all over the world
Oh.
get on the love train. And I highlight the fact that they name, tell all the people in Russia and China, tell all the people in Egypt and Israel, get on board, because if you miss
Mm,
this train, you'll be sorry. And I
mm.
just thought, wow, what powerful poetry and lyrics. And I wanted to include that.
Yeah, that was powerful. I mean, it's so timely. I mean,
Mm,
you're an author of several books. I know we're talking
mm,
about moral leadership, but you also wrote the book Crisis in the Village.
Hmm.
I mean, isn't that what we're going through right now? Crisis
Well,
in
I
the
think you're,
village.
I think you're right on. And in fact, I almost want to tell people or assign these two books together as people think about an answer to Dr. King's last book. The title of his last book in 1968 was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or
Mm-hmm.
Community? And I think that begins with knowing where is here? Where are we right now? And that's
Mm-hmm.
part of what I try to do in the book Crisis in the Village is name the crisis of mission for Black churches, the crisis of identity for many HBCUs and other schools, not clear about who they are and what they're supposed to be doing in the world. And then the crisis of commitment in many families and relationships. And so I began to work through how we move from the crisis towards solutions. And here in the second book, Moral Leadership, I'm really trying to call attention to how anyone can be and become a moral leader if they take heed to the lessons.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the moral leadership, like who are our moral leaderships
Hmm.
today?
Yeah, well, I have an exercise that I do in class, and I also include this in the book. And those who read the book can utilize this in your, adult Bible studies or lessons of all kinds of contexts. It's think about the famous granite carving from the 1940s called Mount Rushmore out in South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
4 U.S. presidents carved in the side of a mountain in the Black Hills. And I challenge and invite students to identify 4 people who they think of as moral leaders. Once again, people of integrity, courage, imagination, who serve the common good, all the people, not just their own people, not just their own zip code.
Mm-hmm.
Have those virtues, serve the common good, and also enlist others, invite others. Those 3 criteria for defining moral leadership. And then I go on to talk about Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Cesar Chavez, and Dolores Huerta. But I asked the students, you name 4 people who are alive today who you think of as moral leaders. And Roz, is fascinating because invariably they'll name 2 famous people
Mm.
and then 2 people that no one in the class has ever heard of. They'll name like my grandmother or my
Oh,
pastor or
oh.
this teacher in the community that feeds children and
Mm-hmm.
people like that. So it's really powerful because it means that you don't have to be a celebrity to become a moral leader.
Mm-hmm.
I would note that nowadays, Dr. Anthony Fauci, his name comes up a lot. People trust him as we move through this COVID-19 crisis.
My
People
goodness.
trust Brian Stevenson, about whom the wonderful movie Just Mercy was made, but the brilliant African American lawyer who's
Mm-hmm.
getting people off of death row by examining evidence and problems in their case patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of moral leaders around. And in
Mm-hmm.
everybody's life, everyone viewing now, people who you would say, this person had a quality of life that moved me, inspired me, invited me to join, to enlist in something. And for me, that's the baseline of what a moral leader, who a moral leader is.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote the book as a textbook?
Yeah, sort of. I wanted to really work as it can work as a textbook because I know a lot of colleges, universities, seminaries, but also business schools and other places that talk
Mm-hmm.
about leadership. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, the last chapter looks at institutions, and I write about Morehouse, about
Mm-hmm.
Chautauqua Institution, but I
Mm-hmm.
talk about all institutions that aim to be enduring institutions and
Mm-hmm.
describe the quality, what helps an institution live from decade to decade, century to century. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is there. And I think it can serve as a textbook. I mean, it's a small book, it's 120 20 or 30
Oh yeah,
pages.
it's
It's
nice
as
book.
they say,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
slender volume. So it's not, it's not War and Peace. You don't have to spend
Mm-hmm.
years reading it.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's also written for people who just want to think more about the topic as we move toward a presidential election, for instance. Think about what it is we want, not just in a president, but at every level of leadership in our country. And this is a way of having that conversation in a more organized, structured way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what moral leaders have influenced you personally?
Well, I opened the book with my grandmother. So back to the
Mm-hmm.
point of
Yes.
these non celebrities, non famous people who had this profound impact. And the reason I talk about her and how she impacted me was that Mother Martha Battle McCann migrated from Mississippi to Chicago. And
Mm-hmm.
there she was with this large family, there's 8 children of her own. And for my childhood, we lived with my grandmother until my parents could save a down payment, buy their own home, and then grandma moved in with us. So
Mm-hmm.
there we were. And one day in front of our home, there was about to be a huge gang fight. Two groups of young
Mm-hmm.
men were arguing, and you
Mm-hmm.
could hear it escalating.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, my grandmother was in the kitchen preparing food, a dinner. And it's also interesting that she had a small garden. This is before urban gardens were in vogue.
Mm-hmm.
Grandma had a garden, and
Wow.
she had prepared fresh fruit and vegetables. She thought, a lot of Black folks moved from the South to the North and were eating out of cans and frozen dinners. She was appalled by that. She said,
Mm-hmm.
people need fresh food, fresh vegetables to be healthy. So
Mm-hmm.
she's preparing her meal. Here's this commotion out front in the street. I was there in the front yard watching it, thinking, boy, this is going to be really exciting. I'm going to get to see a huge fight, and I'm going to
Right.
stay out of the way. I was 8 or 9 years old. Grandma ran out of her kitchen, out into the streets, and put her body in between these two groups of tough, muscle bound young men.
Mm-hmm.
And she just stood there and challenged them. And then what happened next was remarkable because I was thinking, Grandma, you are ruining my reputation. Uh, and she said, now, young man, there's not going to be a fight here today. I know most of you. And most of you, I've fed your mothers and your families from that little garden over there. And I know what it's like for a mother to receive a call that her son, in this case, was shot. And that's not going to happen because my son was shot while he was a soldier during World War II, serving in Italy. No mother wants to receive that phone call, and no one's going to get that call tonight. And
Mm-hmm.
those young brothers looked at each other. They stared each other down. They looked over at her. They looked back at each other. They looked back at her, and they began to back away, grumbling, mumbling under their voices. And there was no
Mm-hmm.
fight that day. For
Mm-hmm.
me, that was the power. That was a parable of what
Mm-hmm.
moral leadership could do. And frankly, as I watched the protests and the public witnesses underway now throughout American cities, I've seen that kind of courageous moral leadership, ordinary women and men stepping up to say, don't burn down our communities. These are communities we built, and we're going to protect our communities. Other people may have their selfish agendas, but we're not going to allow your agenda to collide with our twofold agenda of respecting the dead, the departed, respecting Mr. Floyd's family and other victims who have died and been murdered. And then secondly, of trying to ensure that we can express our concerns, exercise our First Amendment rights while protecting our communities.
So
Sorry for
when
that long answer.
No, that was excellent. I mean, I took a lot away from that.
Mm,
One is grandma used to go out and stop the games. I'm also from
yes.
Chicago, and I
Uh-huh.
remember when grandma would, grandma or auntie would come out, and they would have a lot to say and intervene with our upbringing and when
Yes.
we were doing wrong. So they were considered, our moral leaders at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you also talked about um, just in this COVID and where we are today, trying to find someone to step up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you frame it that way, as we look and search for leadership, you know, uh, Dr. King once used a quote that I still is just seared into my brain, into my heart. And for those who want to find it, it's in his collection of sermons titled, in a little book with 8 sermons of his in it titled Strength to Love. Strength to Love. But the quote is, "This hour in history needs a dedicated circle of transformed nonconformists.
Mm-hmm.
The saving our world from pending doom will come not from the action of a conforming, adjusted majority,
Mm-hmm.
but from the creative maladjustment of a
Mm-hmm.
transformed minority." And so that wonderful phrase, being part of a transformed nonconformist. Transform means you're changed and changing.
Mm-hmm.
But nonconformist means I'm not going along with the status quo, with business as usual, with the normal. I want to change the normal. And I hear Dr. King standing in the streets of Las Vegas and Atlanta and Chicago and Ferguson and Los Angeles and New York tonight saying, hey, we have our eyes on Minneapolis, but we all need to call out the transformed nonconformists to begin thinking about how are we going to rebuild our neighborhoods, our communities, our society
Mm-hmm.
along a more moral guideline.
Well, but did Martin Luther King also say justice or else?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think he was being influenced by Malcolm X at that point. And that's one of the things missing is from today's discussions is, in our time, we had Malcolm and Martin kind of in
Mm-hmm.
in what Pastor Raphael Warnock calls it creative tension.
Mm-hmm.
And young people, especially high school, college students, could listen to the debate between them and see a lot of commonality, a lot of common
Mm-hmm.
ground. And then those places where there were uh, discontinuities and where they disagreed, honestly. And I
Mm-hmm.
think to some extent, some of that is missing today. So
Mm-hmm.
once again, we need those leaders to step up and
Mm-hmm.
show our young people the way.
Mm-hmm. Because he also said the riot is the voice of the unheard.
Yes.
And this was a keg waiting to be lit right now. What we're
Right.
seeing, the uprising and
Yes.
the need for, moral leadership. I guess we need to go out there and hand everybody your book.
Well, I certainly hope there'll be more and more people who are thinking about the questions in the book, whether they get my book or not. I do think that I'm trying to raise some key questions.
Mm-hmm.
How do moral leaders come to be? What is the role of family, of faith, of learning, of reading, etc.? And then it's also a matter of what kind of society do we want to have, and how do you start? And so I think there's a lot of excitement about new possibilities after this terrible moment we are all living in right now. To
Mm-hmm.
have this double barrel COVID-19 and then the crisis of violence against Black people. As we work our way through those,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a better day ahead. As long as we
Mm-hmm.
hang together, as our ancestors used to talk us, walk together, children.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting on the other side.
Yes, yes. So tell me this, what about the Christian community? Where do they fit in right now in terms of moral leadership?
Well, it's interesting. You say Christian community, I always go back to the New Testament and think about the early disciples that Jesus selected to follow him. And
Mm-hmm.
then after that, each of them invited others. Once again, moral leaders invite people.
Mm-hmm.
And you can invite in all kinds of ways. Jesus just walked along the street and would see someone on the shore fishing. He'd say, hey, this is a person that has potential. Follow me.
Mm-hmm.
This Jesus movement over time became the church. But as the church became an institution, too often we simply became a kind of center for gathering and
Yes.
teaching and worship, and all that is good. But we lost to some extent this dimension of outreach and invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean, that have to mean, it can mean traditional evangelism and preaching and etc. But it can also mean befriending people and demonstrating the love that
Mm-hmm.
Jesus represented and his commitment to justice. So I hope the
Mm-hmm.
church will rediscover its roots and go back to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, where Jesus gives everybody his personal mission plan.
Mm-hmm.
In Luke 4 and 16 and 18, he says, I have been anointed to preach good news to the poor, to the recovery of sight to the blind, preach freedom to those who are oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
and to set free those who are bound. So it's a gospel of liberation.
Mm-hmm.
But too many of our churches today have become uh, country clubs where we all feel quite comfortable. We pay the pastor to be a nice private chaplain to our country club.
Mm-hmm. So we received a really great question from Karen Rodriguez. I'd like to
Hmm.
get that out there. And she says, what would be the best themes for preachers these days? She actually has two
Hmm.
questions, but
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd love to hear the other question if there aren't others in the queue. I've seen several people sign in, so thank you to all of you for joining us. And
yeah,
this is my first time in this kind of setting or interview setting. So thank you, Ross, for this opportunity.
you're
I think
welcome.
the themes that we certainly need to focus on, and these are items again that I talk about in chapter 2 of the book. I suggest that moral leaders engage in 5 kinds of activities, one of which is that they are lifelong students of the moral life, which
Mm-hmm.
means they have a curiosity about the key concepts in ethics, which is love, power, and justice. That's the title of a book by one of Dr. King's favorite theologians,
Mm-hmm.
a gentleman by the name of Paul Tillich. And Dr. King and Paul Tillich never met. Mr.
Mm-hmm.
Tillich was teaching in New York at Union Theological Seminary. Then he went to Harvard Divinity School for a few years, and then to the University of Chicago. But he wrote that book, Love, Power, and Justice, and that became a powerful kind of blueprint for Dr.
Mm-hmm.
King to think about his work. So I hope preachers will pay more attention. What is love asking us, calling us to do in this moment?
Mm-hmm.
What about power? How do we exercise power? How do we claim power? How do we utilize it in a responsible, moral way? And then what about justice? I love Cornel West's
Mm-hmm.
phrase that justice is what love looks like in public. And
Whoa.
so those are the principal themes, Karen, that I would begin with. And then back to the other questions as we move beyond and through COVID and through this time of violence, what kinds of communities do we want to create? And that means looking again at what Dr. King had to say about the beloved community, the community that's inclusive, that respects all people, and is safe even for nonconformists.
So, can you teach people then moral leadership? I mean, we have someone in the White House that can.
Hmm.
I know he can't be taught, but are there? can you actually teach moral leadership? I mean, we have, all of
This
these
is,
students,
yes,
Morehouse men. Uh,
indeed.
mhm.
And don't say Morehouse men without saying Spelman women and
Yes,
all of the other
yes,
women
absolutely.
and men in extraordinary co-ed institutions around the nation. I just want to show love and respect to them. But yes, and then you raise a great question. It's a historic question. Goes back to the ancient Greeks. Can you teach morality? Can you teach people to be good people, better people? Can you teach leaders to be moral leaders?
Mhm.
And that question really excites me. I look to one of the people who I've really appreciated his wisdom, Aristotle. And
Mhm.
Aristotle said three things are necessary to produce a good person. He said, number one is moral knowledge. You have to teach
Mhm.
people what is right, what is wrong.
Mhm.
And I wonder how many of the kids that are out there, behaving in ways that we would regard as selfish and immature and destructive, how many of them have really had an orientation, not just the moralizing, preaching at people, but helping them understand why we value telling
Mhm.
the truth, why we value forgiving those who
Mhm.
have harmed us, why we value seeking to keep promises. These
Mhm.
basic things that make for a moral life. So knowledge, you have to know what's right and wrong.
Mhm.
Second is the question of desire. Aristotle says you can know a lot of stuff about the good life, but if you don't have a desire to do it, you'll never go anywhere.
Mm-mm.
And so, how
Mm-mm.
do you instill that intent, that will, that desire? And that's the
Mhm.
role also of incentives for young people. Every parent who's watching this knows that you kind of have to sometimes incentivize behaving well, doing the right
Mhm.
thing. All
Mhm.
right, I used to hear, okay, Bobby, if you do your homework and don't pick a fight with your brother, you can have some ice cream later. Well, that was
Mhm.
enough incentive to get me to say, okay, I need to refrain from messing with my brother, even though he's a pest,
Mhm.
and we would end
Mhm.
up fighting
Mhm.
every
Mhm.
day. I'm not going to do that. I want the ice
Yes,
cream.
yes,
So
yes.
knowledge, will, or desire, and then the third is so important: practice. You have to practice telling the truth, practice keeping promises, practice doing the right thing. And
Mm.
over time, Aristotle says, knowledge, will, and practice produce habits.
Mm.
Habits. He said, this is just, it becomes almost a second kind of nature. This is what I do. This is how I show up when I go
Mhm.
somewhere.
Mhm.
Habits. And then he says further, those habits become character. And
Mhm.
that's your permanent fixed sense of who you are, your moral compass, character. And
Mhm.
so you can teach some parts of that. I
Mhm.
think you can teach the moral knowledge, that first agenda. But the will and desire, maybe not teaching, but I talked about the role of incentives. Make it appealing for people not to have to break into the Walgreens because they don't have a job. They want to feed their children. Give them jobs, give them the dignity of work. So it's the will and the practice that are the challenge that I'm not sure you can teach. But he does say you can model it. You can follow people who are kind of on the right path, and they will demonstrate how it's done. And hopefully
Mhm.
that will inspire and invite.
Yeah, because I think we're missing a generation of moral leaders, but I think that there are some that are coming up that we may
Yes,
not know their name, but they're out on the on the line right now.
exactly
Some of
right.
these young adults that I'm watching speak
Mm.
up at these
Hmm.
rallies are dynamic.
Yes, yes. I mentioned in the book how impressed I am by the students who emerged after the tragic school shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School
Mm.
in Florida, the young leaders of Black Lives Matter. I just watched an interview today with Sister Brittany Packnett Cunningham,
Mhm.
who was leading in the movement and now has worked with President Obama in his initiatives. So The leaders are there. You're absolutely right, Roz. They're all around us. And I would urge more adults to pay attention to the potential for moral leadership in some of the
Mhm.
kids around you. And,
Mhm.
one of the things I'm hoping to do with like principals of high schools and maybe even elementary schools is urge them, maybe the book might be a place to start, to have the faculty read this, but also to have students, freshmen in the college or class or in a seminary class, read together and talk together about the kind of
Mhm.
leadership that's needed.
Mhm.
And while I believe as a Christian, religious faith and a commitment makes all the difference, um, other leaders that I write about didn't necessarily share those same faith commitments. And so that means it's possible to be a moral leader, it's not a spiritual, religious leader, but a moral leader without necessarily having those same faith commitments.
Wow, that's interesting. But
Mhm.
I noticed in the book you had a whole chapter on institutions as moral leaders. So not only are uh, individuals moral
Yeah.
leaders, but you're saying, or are you talking about Nike or?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a perceptive question because most people do focus the conversation about moral leadership on the individuals, these great, extraordinary people. And yet, the first quote, I think, well, after I quote Nina Simone's, I wish you could know what it means to be free. But the next quote is by Oscar Wilde, who says, "Every saint has a past, every
Hmm.
sinner has a future." I love that quote because
Ooh,
it means we're all sinners, we all have potential. We can get it together. We have a future. And
yes,
so,
yes.
yes, I
Mm.
think that we need to encourage that everybody has that potential.
And let me ask you this then, what would a moral leader be doing right now in the midst of this storm that find ourselves in?
Well, I think that, again, it's how do we show respect for the people and the work of the people, the creations of the people. In other words, their homes, their property, their buildings, their stores and restaurants.
Mm,
That's a way of expressing deep respect and
mhm,
love for what has gone before us. And so I think that leaders are currently trying to uh, stop destructive forms of violence and to channel that energy into more constructive forms of activism and energy. And so that's what I see the best of the leaders out there. Some are young, some are old. My grandmother was my first moral teacher. So, grandmas and grandpas who are listening, you have a role to play. And sometimes it's just loving those kids enough for them to respect your values, for them to say, there's something going on inside her life, his life that impresses me, makes me want to imitate what they do. I'm thinking about Aristotle there because he's saying sometimes you can't teach, you have to show. Don't teach, show. Live
mhm,
it out, demonstrate it. And
mhm,
so, in addition to establishing that kind of respect and order, I think we have to rebuild our communities with a new moral vision. Everyone is welcome, everyone is respected, everyone has dignity, which means there should be income, there should be access to health care, there should be homes. People, God's children should not be homeless. This is absurd in a society that has billionaires and then homeless people on the street outside.
mhm.
You know, Microsoft headquarters or Trump Towers, to use two billionaires. So, well, one of them we know is a billionaire at least, but it's this.
A fake
so
billionaire. Good.
I'm gonna let you do the commentary on all of that. But I do think that we have to begin to talk about the new order, the new normal, or as one powerful African entrepreneur said, the next normal, as the way we move forward. Uh, Raj, you made a joke earlier about my writing this book in Antarctica. Actually, no, I didn't. I was thinking about the book, but I didn't write the book at a place called Mesa Refuge, which is a wonderful place in Northern California. And and I saw that one of our dear friends signed on to this call, Susan Page Tillett, who's a wonderful director of that Writers Center, where I spent 2 amazing weeks and
Nice.
really crafted this book. And so I just want to give a shout out to them and very grateful for that.
That's excellent. I mean, it's a well-written, easy to follow guide that is
Mm,
missing. So I'm very happy to have a part of this book. But um, you have quite an impressive list of friends that are moral leaders. I mean, Ambassador Andrew Young, John Less, Reverend Joseph Laurie, just to name a few. Were they influence you in this project?
absolutely, absolutely. You must be referring to the acknowledgments where I note that one of the blessings, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Will always
Mm.
loved Chicago. You're a Chicago homegirl,
Yes, yes,
but
yes.
my second home and my family home has become Atlanta, and the southern Wakanda. And it was here that I had an opportunity to get to know so many of these extraordinary civil rights pioneers, these warriors for American democracy, or as Du Bois would have said, for warriors who sought to rehabilitate American democracy. So it was a blessing and a privilege to get to know, and still know Ambassador Andrew Young, the recently departed and much celebrated and loved Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry. We still need to have an appropriate memorial for that extraordinary life because he passed away in the middle of at the height of the COVID scare. And so everyone was quarantined, as we still should be, I think, for the most part in many places. But also leaders that are lesser known, but certainly Congressman John Lewis, Marion Wright Edelman, and so many others. Yes.
Mhm, mhm. Great, that is amazing. So let me ask you this. I don't know if you heard that Floyd Mayweather has agreed to pay the funeral for the Floyd family.
Ah,
Is
uh-huh.
that a moral leadership role, moral leader, or is
Uh-huh.
that just a nice man?
Well, I actually have another category for that, and
Okay.
we should be on CNN right now. So, right, this conversation is so important, not because I'm a
It
promoter,
is. No,
but
it
these are
is.
precisely the questions and issues that need attention. So, when someone commits some significant act of goodness, does that qualify as moral leadership? And there, Roz, I have a distinction. I would suggest no, not quite.
Mhm,
Maybe, but not yet. We actually reserve that honor. We don't confer that until we see, well, back to Aristotle, a habit, a set of patterns, a series of such acts, a commitment to living one's life in that way.
mhm,
And so, what at the beginning of the book, I distinguish between moral agents and moral leaders. Moral
mhm,
agents are people who may do good in some significant, bold, powerful way like this. That's a wonderful gift on the part of Mr. Mayweather. But they may never do such an act again. They
mhm,
just go back to their lives.
mhm,
On the
mhm,
other hand, if it is habitual and continual, and if they understand they're responding to a call to live their lives that way, that's where you step over the threshold from moral agency to moral
mhm,
leadership.
mhm, mhm. Excellent. So, I mean, I am just delighted to have had this opportunity to speak with you.
Mhm,
I'm a behind the scenes.
mhm,
So I'm stepping out to talk with people such as yourself, leaders. I think it's so critical right now. And I think that you're a moral leader to many of us. So thank you for your leadership. Um, and that you continue to teach and instruct these young men and women on how to become leaders. If there's any other questions, we can take some other questions, or if there's some additional dialogue. I know you're very important. I'm happy to get the hour in that I am allowed to.
Yes, yes. And again, I'm very grateful for those who've been able to sign on for all or some part of our conversation. And I assume you'll let us know when it's ready on YouTube for those who may wish to view it.
Absolutely. Yes, we will upload it to YouTube so that others can hear, because I really think that our young men and women need to stop and consider each of us can be a moral leader. Um,
Yes.
and, let's look up to someone right now in this time that we're in. It's so unfortunate that we don't have a moral leader ahead of this, that's heading up this battle that we're in, two pandemics that we're fighting right
Yes,
now.
yes,
So,
indeed.
uh,
Indeed.
it's a different time. Different time.
Yes. Yeah.
Grandmama and them right now, they're hungry. I mean, so
Yeah. Yeah.
different measures it's, calling for. So,
That's right. That's right.
I think I
Well,
just got another. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just simply saying that because we have had moral leaders in the past, we know what's possible.
Mhm.
And even to cite President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as trying to embody the best of the nation, the promise of African American peoples and all peoples. That I hope will inspire this current generation who may be turned off,
Mhm.
mistrustful of government, of
Mhm.
pastors and priests, of
Mhm.
other authority figures,
Mhm.
of all experts. I hope that they will begin to tune back in once we have more of those leaders emerging. And a lot of them are, I mean, listening to us right now. And we have the power to move the arc of the moral universe in the
Mhm.
right direction.
Mhm. So, we do have another question, and excuse me for mispronouncing your name, Racine. You may want to help me out with that, Dr. Franklin. But the question is, what can the colleges and university do to develop moral leaders in the student population?
Hmm. Hmm. I do think we need to take this more seriously, and that's why I think ensuring that students have, back to Aristotle's model, some knowledge, moral knowledge to begin with. Again, I'll recommend my book because it's slender, easy to read, and students can kind of move through quick through it and get at some interesting little bits and pieces from what a particular artist's lyrics are trying to tell us in the case of the OJs, or what a monument like Mount Rushmore invites us to think about. And throughout the book, little vignettes and stories like that. But there are a lot of great books and the work of Cornell West and so many of the powerful texts that are out there emerging from womanist leaders and theologians. There will be many, many more coming. Um, Michael Eric Dyson's wonderful work looking at Jay-Z in relation to Robert Frost. I mean, it's just amazing stuff. But more knowledge, getting them into the thought patterns of what does it mean to be a good person and what does it mean to create a good community. Those two fundamental categories, the good life, the good person, and the good or just community, are the ancient eternal questions going back to ancient Egypt, Kemet, or all of the great societies that learned from ancient Egypt through the Athens and Greece, the Romans,
Mhm.
and so on up to the current period. So I hope that they would encourage students to read. Then, secondly, to become involved in practice. Back to that third area. So many schools are doing a good job of that. It's going to be interesting if we have to remain in a remote hybrid education for a while, say at least in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So what kinds of service projects might colleges and universities require of their students in order to get credit in communities, helping to rebuild, helping to initiate racial justice conversations between Black and white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American community? We could be creative right now and say, you know, we want you to read some stuff, but we also want you to get out and practice it. I have a colleague at Emory University, Dr. Letitia Campbell, that's working on producing what she calls protest chaplains.
Mm-hmm.
And that means people who are going to be in the street for the coming months, not abandon folks just because there's no more, you know, activism in the street, although who knows, there still may be months from now. But the protest chaplain is out there in the street raising precisely these questions, getting people to think about what does it mean to be a good community and why you can't just throw trash out of your car onto the street if we're going to have a good community.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's excellent. I mean, we just got a great question, and I want to know the answer to this. Karen, you are right on point. She says, when our president, not my president, berates moral leadership, what is the best response? That's excellent. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, and I think this is a former student of mine, Karen G-Jax Rodriguez, an extraordinary leader who was a student at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. I think that, I hope I've got the right Karen there, but if not, I'd simply suggest that there are times when it's important not to engage foolishness, when we should not dignify the immature, petulant response of a leader who hasn't learned the ABCs of ethical leadership and decorum. So so at one level, we don't have the conversation on his or her terms. In fact, we engage in a bit of moral and intellectual jujitsu. We shift it, we flip the conversation from how you want to signify on you know, elected officials or other leaders or moral leaders with whom you disagree. Imagine, I mean, you know, President Trump trying to berate Pope Francis or berate Dr. Anthony Fauci with these retweeting what mean things that others have said, so he gets to wash his hands. It's deeply distressing. Don't have the conversation on that person's terms. Flip the conversation, pivot it to the higher ground. That's what Dr.
Yes.
Samuel DeWitt Proctor used to teach us. And it's having that new conversation on the higher ground that I think is going to make all the difference. Leaders have to learn how to do that. And that's one of the challenges that I talk about in moral leadership, is that in addition to being lifelong students of the moral life, moral leaders frame issues in moral terms. And I outline 5 things they need to do that effectively.
Excellent. So, Dr. Franklin, where can they get the book?
Yeah, and pardon my, you know, making a commercial there, but it's available now on Amazon. Certainly one place, wherever you find your electronic books and hard copy. But I know that Amazon has them both hard copy. They've been mailed out, and I'm seeing them around. And of course, people are simply downloading a copy. It's very reasonably priced, less than a movie ticket, which is kind of a blow to my ego. But hey, we want to get the word out, right? So I do hope that particularly students will be able to afford, and I hope that adults will purchase multiple copies, make them graduation presents, make them presents for students going back to school in the fall.
Yeah, I mean, the timing is just excellent timing right now because we've lost our way. So thank you all for joining us. Constant, we will get you the link that you asked about. And say, Devon, thank you. I think you have a statement more than a question, I believe. leadership is often spoken of in context of singular personalities. He mentions Dr. King, Malcolm X. I believe
Is
that's
that from Devon?
yes, Yvonne.
That may be one of my former students at Morehouse. I regret I can't see the names. Some of them have flashed on the screen, but others have not. In any case, yeah, and I think that notion of collective leadership. Okay, Devon Crawford. Yes. I'm very grateful for this powerful insight, Brother Crawford. And that's again back to the sense of the Mount Rushmore, the fact that you might have a team of leaders working together for the common good. So I'm excited to see how Reverend William Barber is working with other powerful leaders as he talks about the Poor People's Campaign with a highlight day on June 20th. So just a couple of weeks from now. And I hope people will be tuned in remotely to be a part of that effort to talk about how America must do the right thing by changing the equation of inequality and poverty in America.
Well, this has been enlightening and a wealth of information. Of course, I knew it would be. That's why I was so happy to contact you and that you agreed to come on, this show that we can outreach to those that couldn't reach you at CNN or on different levels to have a conversation about moral leadership that we so much need right now. So I thank you.
Roz, I want to thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I feel privileged because your first show was with the leader of the Shy Lights,
yeah.
and then I get to be the second. So I'm following in the footsteps of the stars, and that happens to be a group that I love. So well done, and keep up the
Yes.
good.
Thank you. Thank you. We will be coming back on Sunday. We're going to do a special with Freddie Jackson. He just wrote a tremendous, oh my God, song about what's going on right now. And it's a tearjerker. So we decided to do a special show this Sunday. So come back for those of you that can and join us when we talk more about just living a good life and following moral leaders. So if there's not more that you want to say to the people before we end, I think you covered a lot.
My staff and my family tease me, but I love to end with the words of Rabbi Hillel, who said, "The world is equally balanced between good and evil, and your next act will tip the scale." Amen.
Amen. Amen. And for those that joined us in the end, I want to bring back this young man and let them hear him. So if you all would stand by, Dr. Franklin, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank
Okay.
you. Take care,
Be with
everyone.
me. Be with me. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Wow. Well, that's it for today's Roz's Happy Hour. Hope you all enjoyed listening and talking to Dr. Robert M. Franklin. Please don't forget, it was about moral leadership. Get his book where you can and come back and check us out. Thank you so much. God bless.